And what's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning back into the channel today. My name is Zach Davis, and in this video, I want to do part two of responding to Brian Schwertley. And my intention again is loving grace, just to kind of address some of the issues that he raised. Today, we're going to specifically talk about John chapter 5. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel down below. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can do that, patreon.com/Zach Davis. Hopefully, this will be beneficial to you and helpful. In our last video, we talked about the timing of the resurrection. Today, we'll discuss that a little bit more, and we'll bring along one of the passages that Mr. Schwertley brought up. Now, when you think about some of these passages that are getting brought up, it makes sense to me that they would get brought up. So that's why I discussed Daniel chapter 12, talking about the timing of the resurrection in the last video. Today, I want to kind of play on that a little bit more, but use John 5 and kind of examine the nature of John 5 and what kind of resurrection that it was. Are we talking about physical bodies coming out of the ground? Are we talking about going back into the presence of God? What exactly is going on in the text? And it's so important for us not to bring our presuppositions and force them into the text, but to let the text speak. And today I want to do that, and we'll look at what exactly is going on here in John chapter 5. Mr. Schwertley states, full preterism is stupid, satanic, nonsense. Well, I don't believe that. I think it's godly. I think it's biblical. I think it's correct. And I'm convinced of its correctness, which is why I teach on it. And hopefully, the attitude that I want to convey to people who disagree with me is that there's graciousness and understanding, and at least an ability to see how somebody got there, and at the same time stand firm and stand strong. I don't get offended when somebody says stuff like this. It doesn't really bother me. If that's what he believes, he's got every right to say what he believes, and so forth. But that doesn't mean that we won't examine some of these things. So let's take a look in John chapter 5, which is a pretty popular text, I would say, in discussion of eschatology and resurrection. I know a lot of millennials will discuss it. G.K. Bill brings it up quite a bit. And our text here says this in John 5, most assuredly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life. Most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Let me continue in John chapter 5, over in 28. We read, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming, in which all who are in the graves, Daniel chapter 12, clearly a reference back to it, will hear his voice come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. So let's see what Mr. Schwertley said, and I'm taking this directly from his video that I will link down below in the comments, just like I did. This is still part one. I'm trying to decide how quickly I'm going to work through some of this stuff, as far as how much am I going to spend on the first video versus second video, because he's got a lot of videos. He's doing a lot of stuff on this, but he's throwing a lot of things out. Like in his first video, he throws out a lot of scripture passages, and then he doesn't spend a lot of time on it to prove it, which is why he gets through so much, because I think he's assuming what's right. So anyway, shortly on John 5 says, in this passage, Jesus teaches the following. A specific time is coming in the future when there will be a general resurrection of the dead. I have zero issues with that statement. From when Jesus said that, there was a time coming in his future that there would be a resurrection of the dead, general. And I think he means there both unbelievers and believers, and I agree with that as well. B, this resurrection occurs by the call or order of the exalted mediator, Jesus Christ. I don't have an issue with that statement. C, the resurrection is universal in scope and includes all men who have died, whether Christians or non-Christians. I have zero issue with that either. Parable of the wheat and tares that we looked at from Matthew 13 in the last video talks about the wheat and the tares being resurrected. We have a resurrection to condemnation, a resurrection of the righteous as well. That's the same as Daniel 12. That's the same as Matthew 13. That's the same as the Olivet Discourse, I believe. D, this literal, bodily, universal resurrection of all men is followed by a declaration of judgment. So if you have a resurrection of all men, then you have judgment. That's great. Now, here's where the push and the rub gets. Is this a physical resurrection of bodies coming out of ground? Or is this simply a time when the dead who were in the graves, which I believe is a Hebraism for those just simply who are not physically living anymore, a reference to Hades and Sheol, is this a time when they are judged, brought before the Lord, and judged? So today we're going to discuss a little bit more about really the nature of this. Schwertley says that full preterists cannot explain away this passage, speaking of John 5, without completely ignoring and thus perverting what it says. These passages are not difficult passages. Well, I would agree with that, and I think there's clearly some things in John 5 that give us some indicators of what we need to be looking for that help us to understand why this passage is not difficult. Um, at least in my view as well. So, first thing I want to do, and I don't know why this highlights so much stuff. I only highlighted and now is, so I got to figure that out on my PowerPoint. But nonetheless, let's look at the hour that now is, and let's start in John 4. In John 4, Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, and what I want you to see, the hour that now is in John 4 with the hour that's coming, because these are going to be parallel statements. If the hour that now is and the coming hour in John 4 is a reference to current events then in 8070, John 5 is going to have to be the same thing. Those who are living, the hour that now is, and the hour that's coming is also going to have to be 8070. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain, on Mount Gerizim, nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." And you think about that from the Jewish standpoint, that whenever the tribes split, you had 10 north, 2 south. You've got worship that's set up there on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, and then you've still got worship going on in Jerusalem. Jesus says, look, it doesn't matter. We're not going to, there's coming a day when you're not going to worship on either one of these. And then we understand that spiritually New Jerusalem language, that the old covenant system would pass away. We don't go to Jerusalem to worship anymore. Jesus says, the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. So the hour is coming and now is. This was an already present. Now is, meaning they were worshiping in that manner now. And I don't know of anybody that would disagree with that. You could possibly put the beginning of verse 23, where the hour is coming, in mind in your future, but not the now is part. You'd have to put that in the time of Christ. Examining the present tense, most assuredly I say to you, this is going back to John 5. Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life. This is something that they already had. If they were dead, they've been given life, living in the first century, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed, past tense, from death into life. From death into life. Let's just say this again. The living at the time of Christ, who would believe in him, had passed from death to life. Most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Now, hang on. Let's just stop for a second on this one, because this is so important. The hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice. Now, hang on. How is that happening right then? Were people being physically raised out of the ground whenever Jesus says this in John chapter 5? And the answer to that's no. Well, what's the now is? It's the same thing he just said right above that. Whoever hears my word and believes him has sent me has passed from death to life. So the dead would hear is not strictly a reference to those who are physically dead, because here in John 5, it includes saints who were physically alive, yet they were spiritually dead, but they passed from death to life while they were physically living. This means that their death was a spiritual death and they passed into spiritual life, that they were brought back into the presence of the Lord, given everlasting life. That's the way that I would take that. But the hour was coming when the dead would hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. So you've got the physically alive who are spiritually dead hearing the voice of the Lord, they believe come to life, but there would be a future time when the dead saints would also be raised and brought to life. This is clearly a reference back to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, when we read, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting shame and contempt." So this is a connection of John 5 and Daniel 12. You can't separate John 5 from Daniel 12. All millennialists such as G.K. Bill do a really good job of that. That's the paradigm that you have to work with. So what I want to make sure we understand is that in the resurrection, just like with the kingdom, just like with so many things of the already not yet, there is an already not yet of the resurrection. And let me give you some bullet points here on this. Number one, the resurrection began for the living saints in the first century. The resurrection began for the living saints in the first century. When they believed, they were brought from death to life. Number two, the hour that now is the already. The hour that now is the already. So when Jesus is saying that was already happening, there's your already of the already not yet. Number three, the hour that is coming is the not yet. There's an hour coming, but now is. And there you go. This is such an issue for so many people because so many people think we're still living in the already not yet. Friends, if I could help you understand, the already not yet was connected to the passing of the law in the first century, in the fulfillment when things had to have taken place, we would have a better grasp of the times that we're living in, specifically that we're living in the new heavens and new earth, because this has passed away. Anyway, the living saints pass from death to life while living. Okay, the dead saints would be raised at the end of the age. That's your not yet. So you don't have judgment happening on the living at that time. That will happen at the end of the age. But those who were physically alive but spiritually dead, who believed in the Messiah, they were coming to life. So let's continue to look at the already. Ephesians 2:1 says, "And you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and in sins." Physical death or spiritual death? Well, obviously that's spiritual. They've been made alive. Here's what I think happens. A massive assumption happens whenever we say, okay, this is obviously talking about regeneration. This is talking about them being born again. This is talking about them passing from death to life spiritually. A massive assumption happens when people start pointing to the people in the graves and saying, yeah, well, when this happens for them, they're going to physically come out of the ground. No, they were in Hades. They were going to go back into the presence of God. This is why in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 13, Daniel is told he would rise to his inheritance at the end of the days. The end of what days? End of the days of the old covenant age. Daniel's physical body is still in the ground, wherever it was, decomposed as it is. Daniel is in heaven in the presence of the Lord. This is his rising or his resurrection, because these who were living had already been made alive, and those who were dead would come to life at the end of the age. The already continues. The living saints did not yet possess the fullness of eternal life. The living saints did not yet possess the fullness of eternal life. That would come at the end of the age when all was fulfilled. So if you ask me the question, were the living saints fully restored to the presence of God? My answer would be no, because in Revelation 11, I don't believe that the temple was opened until the destruction of the city at the fulfillment of the law. So here's a legitimate question that needs to be asked. Before Christ, before Acts 2, let's just say before Christ, before the ministry of Christ, if someone was a believer and died, they would go to Hades, not to heaven. Okay? I think we can agree on that. Most Christianity should be able to agree on that. The question then becomes, when was Hades emptied? And I don't think Hades was emptied at the resurrection or the ascension. I believe that Hades was emptied in AD 70 at the resurrection. Now, the question that I would have, and one that I'm trying to work out, where did the saints who are alive, okay, take whoever Paul's writing to in Ephesians 2, you were dead, you he made alive who once were dead in trespasses and sins. Where did they go when they died? Did they go to Hades, or did they go to heaven, or Revelation 6 is under the altar somewhere different? That's a question and something that I need to work out. I'm trying to work out. But here's what I am confident of. The living saints could not be weren't fully resurrected, brought into the presence of God until the end of the old covenant age. This is why Paul says things like in 1 Corinthians 13, we see him in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. So when you read your stuff in 1 Corinthians 15 about we will not all sleep, we will all be changed. I think that's a covenantal change because the dead rise at that time out of Hades and the living are covenantally restored. That's why from 80, 70 on, they die and go to heaven. There's fulfillment language that's connected to the law. And the reason that it's connected to the law is because the law had to be removed in order for the death, 1 Corinthians 15, to be defeated. So you read passages like Luke 21:28, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and Jesus says, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift your heads because your redemption draws near. Well, he's talking to those who had already passed from death to life. What's he mean? Well, were they saved? Yes. Were they being saved? Yes. Were they fully saved, I believe, in AD 70? Yes. That's the already not yet. Already, were they saved? Yeah. Were they redeemed? Yep. Were they waiting redemption? Yep. Already not yet. You and I aren't still in the middle of that, though, guys. We're on the back side of it. Galatians 5:5 says, for we, through the Spirit, eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. Well, hang on. Did they already have righteousness? Yep. Were they waiting on righteousness? Yep. How? Already not yet. They're waiting on the high priest to come out of the temple to declare them righteous on the day of atonement, which is the whole purpose of Hebrews, specifically 7, 8, and 9, and 10. Hebrews 9:28. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Were they saved already? Yep. Were they awaiting salvation? Yep. How? Already not yet. And Daniel 9:24 says that all of these things would happen. He would bring in everlasting righteousness inside of the 70 weeks that would end with the destruction of the temple. This is why the resurrection is connected to the end of the age with the passing of the law, and it fulfills your already not yet time. Go read the New Testament. Every one of these things, like right here, they're eagerly waiting in Hebrews 9:28. For we, through the Spirit, eagerly wait, Galatians 5. They're always, Romans 8, they were eagerly waiting their adoption as sons. It's all eager. Why? Because it was something that was coming upon them quickly, and they knew it. So, this resurrection is not something that's physical, it's something that was spiritual. Then you get to the not yet. Scout's honor. I only highlighted the hour is coming. I don't know why it's doing this. This is like the third or fourth time it's done this. We did it when me and Travis made some videos, but it doesn't show it on the normal PowerPoint, only when I get into the recording session. But anyway, it's okay. We'll make it work. I know it's hard to read. Just go back and read John 5:28 here. Jesus says, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming. There's our not yet future, in which all who are in the graves, there's your physically dead, will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. That's where I agree with Mr. Schwertley in talking about those all righteous and unrighteous would be raised and would be judged. Matthew 13 says that happens at the end of the age. And I would agree with that completely. So you're not yet, connection with the already. Here's one thing I think we need to make sure we understand. It's that the living and the dead saints would be perfected together. Let me say that again. The living saints and the dead saints would be perfected together. That's why the dead in Christ would rise first. We who are alive and remain would be called up or brought back into the presence of the Lord. Hebrews 11:39-40 says this. In all these, having obtained a good testimony, well, who are all these? All of the old covenant saints that he just listed all the way back to Abel in Hebrews 11, Hall of Faith. All these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they, the Old Testament dead saints, should not be made perfect apart from us. I think that's the whole issue in 1 Corinthians 15 too. They're denying the resurrection of the dead saints. And Paul's saying, no, if they're not raised, then Christ wasn't raised. And if they're not raised, then you won't be raised. The living saints, first century, and the dead old covenant saints would be perfected together at the passing of the law. That's why the dead would rise and the living would be transformed. We will not all sleep. We will all be changed. So what questions would I ask? I would ask these questions. Number one, if the already is spiritual, why does the not yet have to be physical? You can't say that those who were alive in the first century were physically raised. That doesn't make sense. They weren't physically dead. Two, were the living saints physically raised? No, they weren't physically raised. They were spiritually raised. They had passed from death to life. Spiritual. It's inconsistent, therefore, to necessitate that the dead who are in the graves, and what I think happens is people read graves and it just throws them off. Yes, it's got to be physical. They're in the graves, this is physical. No, it doesn't mean that. Examine the context and the timing, and examine the nature, and they've got to harmonize. And I think the only way to harmonize John 5, either you're going to have to say the living saints were physically raised, which doesn't make a lick of sense, or that the living saints were spiritually brought back into the presence of the Lord, and the dead saints would be spiritually brought back into the presence of the Lord at the end of the age. I think that's the only consistency I can find in John 5. Now, could I be wrong? Yeah. Go study it and examine it for yourself. I'm just doing the best I can. Number 3, is it possible futurists are assuming physical bodies come out of the ground since the text never points us there? And obviously, you guys know I think that's an assumption that's being made, that physical bodies have to come out of the ground because they're reading physical death into the curse back in Genesis. So we got to understand what kind of death we're trying to get rid of here, and we believe that it's spiritual death. This is why, for anyone who's saved in the city, there is no death in the new heavens and the new earth. There's no separation from God for us who know the Lord. And that's a marvelous truth, that we are with him always. I hope this is helpful to you. My examine of John 5. Pray it's received with love and grace. Have a great day. God bless you. And we will see you soon. Don't forget to like and subscribe down below.